The swamp was a place of death. Thick, green mist hung in the air, carrying with it the acrid stench of decay. The ground was a treacherous mix of mud and water, bubbling with unseen toxins that could kill a man in minutes. Few dared to venture into the Blackfen Swamp, and those who did rarely returned. But Kael had no choice. His village was dying, and the only cure for the plague that ravaged his people was said to grow deep within the swamp's heart. Kael was no hero. He was a simple farmer, strong from years of labor, but untrained in combat or survival. His only weapons were a rusted machete and a small vial of antidote, brewed by the village healer. The antidote would buy him time, precious minutes, if he inhaled too much of the swamp's poison. But it wouldn't save him if he got lost or if one of the swamp's many predators found him. He trudged forward, his boots sinking into the muck with every step. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and the mist seemed to close in around him. He pulled his scarf over his nose and mouth, hoping to filter out some of the toxins. His heart pounded in his chest, not just from exertion, but from fear. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound seemed to whisper danger. And then he saw her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the mist, a figure half submerged in the murky water, her dark hair fanned out around her like a halo. But as he drew closer, he realized she was real. A woman, unconscious and sinking slowly into the swamp. Her armor, though caked in mud, gleamed faintly in the dim light. She was no ordinary traveler. Kael hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, to focus on his mission. But he couldn't leave her to die. Gritting his teeth, he waded into the water, the toxic sludge pulling at his legs like a living thing. The closer he got, the harder it became to breathe. His vision blurred, and his head spun, but he forced himself forward. When he reached her, he grabbed her arm and pulled with all his strength. She was heavier than she looked, her armor adding to the weight. The swamp fought him, sucking at her body as if unwilling to let her go. Kael's muscles burned, and his lungs felt like they were on fire, but he didn't stop. With one final heave, he dragged her onto solid ground. He collapsed beside her, gasping for air. His hands trembled as he fumbled for the vial of antidote. He took a small sip, just enough to clear his head, then turned to the woman. She was pale, her lips tinged with blue, but she was breathing. Kael checked her for injuries, but aside from a few shallow cuts, she seemed unharmed. Her armor, though battered, had protected her from the worst of the swamp's toxins. Kael didn't know who she was or how she had ended up in the swamp, but he couldn't leave her here. He slung her over his shoulders, ignoring the protest of his aching muscles, and began the long trek back to the village. The journey was a nightmare. The swamp seemed to come alive, its mist thickening and its creatures stirring. Kael heard the low growl of a fen wolf somewhere in the distance, and the water rippled with the movement of unseen things. He moved as quickly as he could, but the woman's weight slowed him down. His legs felt like lead, and his breath came in ragged gasps. More than once, he thought about leaving her behind, but each time he pushed the thought away. He had saved her. He couldn't abandon her now. By the time he reached the edge of the swamp, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the landscape. Kael's strength was nearly gone, but he forced himself to keep going. The village was just ahead, its lights flickering like beacons in the gathering darkness. When he finally stumbled into the village square, the villagers rushed to meet him. They took the woman from his arms and carried her to the healer's hut, while others helped Kael to a bench. He sat there, dazed and exhausted, as the healer tended to the woman. It wasn't until the next morning that Kael learned the truth. The woman's name was Lyra, and she was no ordinary warrior. She was the legendary hero who had defeated the Dark Lord Malakar a decade ago, ending his reign of terror and freeing the land from his tyranny. After the war, she had disappeared, leaving behind only stories and rumors. No one knew where she had gone or why she had returned. When Kael entered the healer's hut, Lyra was awake. She sat on the edge of the cot, her armor cleaned and repaired, her dark eyes sharp and alert. She looked at him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You saved me," she said finally, her voice low and steady. "Why?" Kael shrugged, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "I couldn't leave you there." Lyra studied him, her gaze piercing. "Most people would have. The swamp is deadly, and I was a stranger. You risked your life for me." Kael looked away. "I didn't know who you were. I just couldn't leave you." Lyra nodded, as if his answer satisfied her. "You have a good heart, Kael. That's rare in these times." Over the next few days, Lyra recovered quickly. The villagers treated her with a mix of awe and reverence, but she seemed uncomfortable with their attention. She spent most of her time with Kael, asking him about the village and the plague that had struck it. "The cure you seek," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. "It's called the starbloom. It grows deep in the swamp, in a place called the Shimmering Glade. But the glade is guarded by the swamp's most dangerous creatures. Even I would hesitate to go there." Kael frowned. "Then how am I supposed to get it?" Lyra smiled, a rare and unexpected expression. "You're not going alone. I owe you my life, Kael. I'll help you." The next morning, they set out for the swamp. With Lyra by his side, the journey was easier. She moved with the grace and confidence of a seasoned warrior, her sword cutting through the mist like a beacon of light. She taught Kael how to move quietly, how to avoid the swamp's dangers, and how to fight if necessary. When they reached the Shimmering Glade, they found it just as Lyra had described, a place of eerie beauty, filled with glowing plants and shimmering water. But it was also guarded by a massive serpent, its scales glistening like oil in the dim light. Lyra didn't hesitate. She charged at the serpent, her sword flashing in the mist. Kael watched in awe as she fought, her movements a blur of speed and precision. But even she couldn't do it alone. When the serpent lunged at her, Kael acted on instinct. He grabbed a fallen branch and struck the creature's head, distracting it long enough for Lyra to deliver the killing blow. The serpent collapsed, its body sinking into the water. Kael and Lyra stood there, breathing heavily, before Lyra turned to him and smiled. "You're braver than you think, Kael." They gathered the starbloom and returned to the village. The cure worked, and the plague was soon eradicated. The villagers celebrated, but Kael found himself thinking about Lyra. She had saved them, just as he had saved her. In the end, Lyra left as quietly as she had come. She didn't say goodbye, but she left Kael a gift, a small, silver pendant shaped like a star. "You have the heart of a hero, Kael," she had written in a note. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Kael never saw her again, but he never forgot her. And though he returned to his life as a farmer, he carried her words with him, a reminder that even the simplest of men could make a difference.